So having talked about World War I, we'll talk about another decision-making process at a time of war or possible war. This one also from the distant past, although not quite as distantly past. Right, it's from about 60 years ago rather than from about 100 years ago. Cuba is a particularly interesting case because this is probably the closest we've ever come to throwing a full-scale nuclear war. And at the height of the crisis, or afterwards I should say, John F. Kennedy said that the chances of going to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis were between 1 out of 3 and even. So it's important as a case in and of itself. It's also important as a contrast to World War I. And one of the interesting questions to ask is how did we avoid war in the Cuban case? Despite the fact that, as I'm going to point out, there were all kinds of mistakes made. I'm also going to try to highlight a couple of the really smart or wise things that some of these decision makers did. So what I'm going to do, I just got an outline here, is I'm going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis in general, talk about the rational actor model, which is kind of the standard way we think about these things, and then I'm going to very briefly touch on aspects of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, that illustrate all these different alternatives to the rational actor model. And then I'm going to make one quick reference to how this applies to the U.S. and Iraq, which is another case that seems to have been shaped by considerable misperception. Okay, so Cuban Missile Crisis. The basic deal is it's 1962. The U.S. has lots of missiles based in places like Turkey and in Central Europe that we can hit the Soviet Union. We have not yet invented the missiles that fly all the way around the world. And the Soviets want to be able to hit us with their missiles. And so they decide they'll take some of their missiles and stick them in Cuba. So we just get to the basic question, why do the Soviets install missiles in Cuba? Simple answer, right? It's the cheapest way to overcome their disadvantage, right? And so just to be clear, what we've done is, in answering the question this way, we've assumed that the answer to why they put missiles in Cuba must be, well, what was putting missiles in Cuba a rational response to? So we've really assumed the rationality of this decision. The U.S., in order to, when it discovers the missiles are under construction, it decides to blockade Cuba to prevent the missile installations from being completed. And for a long time, early in the crisis, the dominant strategy, the preferred strategy, seemed to be an air attack on Cuba, bomb the missile installations. Eventually, the U.S. chose the strategy of blockade. Well, why? And, well, again, the rational action model would lead us to say, well, that was the best way to achieve U.S. goals at the lowest cost. We're going to question all that. So bureaucratic politics. One of the things that happens that makes the crisis worse is just as the U.S. discovers these missile sites under construction, we delayed our spy plane flights over Cuba for 10 days. That does not seem rational, right? That seems, in fact, crazy. This is U-2. U-2 was a spy plane before it was an Irish pop band, and this is a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba in 1962. This is how we got our information about Cuba. That, of course, and a whole lot of spies on the ground. Why would we delay spy plane flights over Cuba? Well, the short answer is it basically comes down to the bureaucratic politics model. The Air Force had been flying these spy planes, and the CIA also flew spy planes. And the CIA said, hey, this is I'm sorry, I've got it backwards. The CIA had been flying the missions because they do spying, but the Air Force came along. The Air Force never liked the fact that the CIA got to fly planes because they thought only the Air Force should fly planes. And the Air Force said, hey, this is starting to look like a possible combat situation, right? If these planes are going to get shot at, they should have Air Force pilots in them who are military personnel, not CIA personnel who technically are civilians. And the CIA said, it's a spy mission, we should fly the planes. And essentially, they basically took 10 days to solve this question of who was going to fly the planes. And their compromise, while they decided, was that nobody flew any planes, right? You can imagine this is almost like a parent dealing with two recalcitrant children, right? Neither of you gets it until we sort things out. So, and the big point about the bureaucratic politics model is the result, this 10-day delay, was not something that anybody was advocating for, right? The Air Force wanted one thing, the CIA wanted another. The result was something altogether different. Incidentally, the resolution was that they had Air Force officers fly CIA planes, classic Washington compromise. This is a view from one of those U-2 spy planes of a Soviet SA-2 missile site in Cuba in 1962. And you'll notice there's a really interesting pattern there. It almost looks like a pentagram with some, I don't know, spiked wheels in the middle of it. One of the things that happened is once we got the U.S. CIA got these pictures, they knew right away what this was, because this looked like every single missile site in the Soviet Union, and we've been flying planes over them for years. So one of the questions is, why did the Soviets build the missiles in ways that gave away telltale signs of exactly what this was? After the Soviets had taken incredible caution to get all these materials to Cuba without everybody knowing. They sent them in unmarked ships. They got all the Cubans off the ships because they didn't trust the Cubans, so it was only Russians. None of the Russians were in military uniforms. We could go on and on. They were very, very careful. But who is it that actually knows how to set up a missile site? And the answer is it was the Soviet missile forces. The Soviet missile forces really weren't trusted to be in on the whole big plan. So what did they do? They built a missile site. And they knew how to build a missile site. They followed the exact same plans for a missile site that they've been following all along, because of course there's a reason that the missile site looks this way. It's efficient, the way things are clustered, and so on. So essentially, standard operating procedures led to an operational disaster for the Soviets. Largely because the left hand didn't know exactly what the overall plan was or what the right hand was doing. Then we get into group dynamics, right? And so one of the things that we worry about in decision-making situations is what is generally known as groupthink. And one of the great successes of the Cuban Missile Crisis was how the Kennedy administration avoided groupthink. So when the crisis broke out, one of the things that John F. Kennedy did, and you can see him here in the picture over underneath that window, one of the things that Kennedy did was he didn't use one of the standard decision-making bodies. He put together an ad hoc body. So he didn't follow standard operating procedures. He says, who needs to be here? Who do I trust? So right away, things were different. He did two other things to avoid groupthink, or the kind of group dynamics where everybody rushes to a decision. One is he assigned somebody as the devil's advocate, a guy named George Bundy, who was the national security advisor. The other thing is that for some of the key decisions, he left the room. His belief being people would be more willing to continue an open discussion if the president weren't there. Now, Kennedy always knew exactly what was being said because his brother, Robert Kennedy, was the Attorney General, and he was in the meetings. But part of the goal was to not arrive through group pressure or peer pressure for everybody to arrive at a decision very quickly and then stop questioning it. And in fact, a very quick consensus emerged on going to war over this, right? We were going to bomb Cuba. And Kennedy was like, well, what happens then? So Kennedy deserves a lot of credit for not going with the original thing and saying, keep talking about it. Keep discussing it, keep discussing. And eventually they came up with the solution of the blockade, which was a lower conflict level way of dealing with it. Technically speaking, in international law, a blockade was still an act of war, but you weren't blowing anything up. And, crucially, it gave Khrushchev more time to consider his own position. So, misperception. We can talk a lot about misperception, but the big ones here are, why did the Soviets think they could get away with it? Why was the U.S. so surprised? One of the ways we're going to answer that is by looking at individual psychology. Why did the Soviets think they could get away with it? Well, part of it you might point to the policies of, the personality of Khrushchev. He had done a lot of ambitious things in Russia and the Soviet Union itself that were later known as harebrained scheme. Khrushchev loved the big, bold move. He loved the idea that they were going to sneak these missiles in and nobody was going to know about it. And he was going to show up later in October at the United Nations in New York for a planned speech, and he was going to say, we've got missiles in Cuba. How about that, guys? Right? So he just loved the idea of this big surprise. Kennedy had his own reasons for thinking that what you might call motivated bias. Kennedy and Khrushchev had already had one summit in 1961, and the perception around the world was that the youthful Kennedy had been kind of shown up by the older, more experienced Khrushchev. And so Kennedy had kind of ended up feeling like he'd been humiliated. And he felt like he couldn't survive another humiliation by Khrushchev. And so in a way, it was his fear of being shown up again that led him to believe it can't happen, it won't happen. But surely it did. So that's a very quick run through the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a great book on it, if anybody, or several great books, but one in particular that gets into this. But to move forward to another famous case, so I showed you the pictures of the Soviet SAM sites in Cuba. Well, this is a similar sort of thing from 2003. And essentially what the U.S. intelligence agency said is, here, we took this picture on the 10th of November, and there was this chemical munitions bunker. And now we went back on the 22nd of December, and you can see it's gone, right? The bunker's been gone, or it's been cleaned out, just as the United Nations is arriving, right? And the argument that was made was, this shows that even if it looks like Iraq doesn't have a weapons of mass destruction program, it really does, and they're just tricking us. Now, it turns out, once we invaded and went and investigated, we found out that these weren't actually WMD sites. And so we can ask the question, right, what accounts for that misperception? Is it motivated bias, unmotivated bias? There was a major U.S. government report on that, which ended up, and I make reference to this in the textbook, ended up pointing to the problem in particular of groupthink. There are others that are more cynical and think that the Bush administration simply cooked the intelligence because it felt like going to war. And there's some reason to believe that. So misperception, well, I should say, not just misperception, all of these different factors or pathologies can take place, and all of them cause us to be cautious about the assumption that states make a foreign policy rationally or as we might expect. And for me, one of the big takeaways about this is if a country is making a foreign policy, and for that foreign policy to work depends on the other side clearly perceiving what it is that you're doing and responding rationally to it, you'd better be careful, because clear perception and predictable perception and total rationality does not always seem to happen. So again, to summarize, if your policy really depends on perfect rationality on the other side, you might want to look for a different policy.